Okay, so we are going to continue on with just the last part of natural selection, which is very short today. So for natural selection, guys, we already talked about it shaping evolution. So in natural selection occurring, it leads to evolution. Now, going back a step from natural selection, we say that natural selection is pretty much influenced by survival of the fittest. Now, when we talk about fitness, it's just the individual's contribution to the next generation. So what they are giving to the next generation. Now, they're not giving like, oh, here's a proverb that I learned throughout my life and let me share that with you. Instead of that, it's actually giving your genes, giving your traits to the next generation. So the most fit individuals, it's measured by how long they are alive and how many times they reproduce. In reality, guys, the one that reproduces the most is considered the most fit, which is kind of funny, but yeah. Okay, so we already talked about it describes natural selection. The most fit ones, they survive and reproduce. We're good there. Now, two different vocab words, adaptation and acclimatization. So acclimatization sounds very intense. It's not. I'll shorten it for you in a minute. Adaptation, so these are traits that are going to make an individual successful at surviving and reproducing in that environment. So individuals cannot adapt, and rather you are given your traits, your adaptations, from the previous generation. The second one here, acclimatization, here's an easy way to think about this. Acclimatization, shorten it to acclimate. All right, it's just a shortened version of it. So this is a process in which changes take place in a single being in its own lifetime. So adaptations, we talked about individuals and they cannot adapt. But acclimatization says this is something that can change in your lifetime. So cats, fish, really good examples of this. Dogs too. If you've seen a cat or a dog in the summertime, their fur might be a little bit thinner. They are going to shed a little bit more just to try to get rid of that excess fur because it's warm outside. But in the wintertime, they are going to pack on the fur. They're not going to shed as much. They're going to grow a thicker, fuller coat in order to stay warm, especially if they're an outside dog or an outside cat. That is acclimatization. They are acclimating to the temperature. Another one, you bring a fish home. And obviously there's water in a bag and they keep the fish in there for you to transport it to home so you could put it into your fish tank or aquarium. Now, if you just dump the fish in there, that fish is probably going to die. The only time it won't is if the temperature of the water inside the bag and the temperature inside the aquarium are pretty close together. If they are far away, what you're going to do is you're going to put that bag in the water just like that, probably for about 20 minutes to a half hour. And what's going to happen is the temperature inside of that bag is then going to change to match the temperature inside of the fish tank. Then you can let the fish out. What the fish is doing is it is slowly acclimating to the different temperature of inside the fish tank compared to inside the water it was originally in. So that's what we mean when we talk about acclimating. Okay, so section 2. We're going to go over evidence of evolution. And I thought this was interesting because this is a...
Pardon the interruption. The following ninth graders.
So this is a quote by Walt Disney. It says, "Progress is impossible without change." If you think of it with humans, other animals, we are progressing, we are evolving, we are going through natural selection. And in the process, we are changing just a little bit, not much. Here are two fossils. The one on the right is going to be a very, very, very prehistoric organism. And you guys can see that, I mean, obviously it's in the rock there. It's more of like cartilage and things like that, very little bone. This one a turtle, it's going to be a little bit later where organisms started to develop bones, started to develop an internal structure rather than an external. Okay, so going on to fossils, and I know we talked about fossils a little bit at the beginning of this chapter, but fossils show us extinct organisms as well as give us evidence for evolution. So we're linking the past to things that are going on now. This little hamster, weasel, I don't even know what looking guy, possum kind of, this is what we think is a common ancestor to humans, to monkeys. Now this was way, way, way far back, so I don't want you guys to go home and go, hey, Communal said this is our ancestor, this is how human, no, okay? This is a common ancestor, but it was way, 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 way far back. Kind of right after the Jurassic extinction, where we had the rise of mammals. So this is going way far back. Okay. All right. So going on to the fossil record, it's kind of funny because you think of evolution in the church as two completely separate entities. If you believe in evolution, you're kind of going to be a little bit distant from the church. And if you believe in church, you're not going to believe in evolution. But a lot of the people that actually shaped evolution were really big into theology back in the day. So first one, Nicolaus Steno. So he proposed this principle of superposition. Really simple. If you have rock strata, and there's been no tectonic shifts, there's been no earthquakes, nothing major has happened in that area. Our lowest strata is going to be formed before the upper strata. So in other words, the bottom layer is going to be the oldest, the top layer is going to be the youngest. And that's all he said. When he was looking at all this stuff, as he was going down, he noticed that some of the things he found were actually older than some of the stuff closer to. And he also found differences in the appearance of these fossils that he found. Obviously, this one right here, there's your ruler down there. This would be the leg bone of some organism. Now, these are much bigger than our leg bones, so they were thinking maybe this was a dinosaur or something like that. Okay? All right. So, again, guys, it was almost like, if we have our onion here, it was almost like everything had layers to it. And as we peeled back these layers or got deeper into the strata, we were able to find a lot of the things that shaped our world today. We were able to find out things that were different in the previous species before we were around, and maybe what happened in the environment to cause this change to occur. So we began studying everything. We began studying the fossils. We began studying the rocks around the fossils to try to date them and kind of come up with an order of when all these events occurred. So two different vocab words here, guys, we're going to go over. First one is relative age. Now, when we are finding all of these fossils, we can estimate the relative age of this fossil. Now, it's not numerical. So when you are doing the relative age, we have to have at least two fossils together. The first one, if you're looking at it, if it's above strata or above a lower layer or above the other fossil, we would say it's younger. And whatever fossil is below it, we would say is older than that fossil. So it doesn't give us numbers, but it does say, okay, look at this fossil, look at this fossil. We know that the one up top is younger than the one below it. And that's pretty much all the relative age is. So it helps us to compare our fossils to show that, okay, I know this organism came first, and let's look at the changes that happened from this organism to the ones that are more recent. So here's a bunch of different animals here, guys. And they were able to use, if this is the strata going downward, they were able to see all these different organisms in the strata and say, okay, well, I know this one came first. This is how we learned that dinosaurs actually came before mammals. And after we had something happen to the environment, then mammals started to emerge onto Earth, and they started to form different species and fill the environment with whatever the need was with respect to, like, one organism produced food and then the other were all just consuming the food and consuming things that were consuming the food and so on and so forth. Now the absolute age, this is going to be the next one. Absolute age is going to be a little bit different. So instead of like the relative age, where we are just, okay, this fossil is older than this fossil, this is actually giving the number to how old these fossils are. Now, how do we do this? Okay, I have a fossil here. Let me see how many years old it is. It's not like a tree where we're going to cut it open and let's see how many rings there are. It doesn't work like that. Instead, the absolute age, what we're going to do is we are going to use radioactive isotopes, or just even regular isotopes, that are surrounding the fossil, surrounding the rock, and we're going to test them to see how old they are. And when we test those rocks or even those fossils, we can determine how many years ago it is. Now, I know you guys have heard of carbon dating. A lot of these things are so old that carbon is actually not a good element to use. Instead, we're going to use like potassium or uranium or different elements like that to determine the age of these fossils. Okay. All right. We're good here. Okay. So the other thing we can see from this is if we have a layer of strata, and I'll draw a few different layers here. And I'm just going to write some numbers here. We're going to say this is fossil 1. And we're going to say this is fossil 2. We'll say this is 3. Say this is 4, 5, I don't know, 6. Okay. So what this says is if we look at adjacent strata here, this tells us that 1 and 3 are going to be similar. More similar than 2 and 5, okay? So if we were comparing 1 to 5, it's going to be a little bit less similar compared to 1 to 3. So when they're in adjacent strata or the same strata, they are going to be very similar. Now, when we're talking about similarities, we're talking more with respect to what they look like. Because what that's going to do is that's going to tell us what the environment was like. Okay, look at these two organisms. They're very similar. We know that since they maybe are cold-blooded, both of them are cold-blooded, the environment might have been really warm back then. All right. So here again, guys, a bunch of different layers of strata here. Okay, we have mammals all the way up top. And monkeys were here before that, and apes, and then we had the emergence of mammals after the dinosaurs went extinct. Now, I've been using this term for common ancestors, and we, have a common ancestor to monkeys. We did not come from monkeys, as I keep saying. Another word to talk about these is called a transitional species. All right. When we're talking about transitional species, we are going to have, just like us and monkeys, on our tree, we're going to have monkeys on this side. We're going to have humans. All right. Right here is where our common ancestor or our transitional species was. So we got a fork in the road, and that gave rise to both of these different organisms right here. So going on with this, guys, I saw a really interesting video of a whale, and the whale had a baby, and what was going on is in the water, the baby whale was unable to come all the way up to the surface. So what the mother would do is when the whale, the baby whale, needed oxygen, needed to breathe, the mother whale would get underneath the baby whale and actually hoist it up to the surface so that way it could breathe. Kind of crazy, right? And it's weird because the whales live in the water, but they still have to breathe regular air. They don't have gills. The whales are mammals. So it's kind of weird that they would ever live in the water to begin with, right? So what we think over time, if we look up here, this was a whale or a common ancestor of a whale back in the day. You guys can see it has front legs, it has back legs. What we think is it one time lived on land. Then something happened. We don't know what happened, but something happened that the whale had to enter the water. And then you guys can see it changed a little bit here. It started using its limbs to be able to swim. And then over time, what happened was it was only using its front limbs. It wasn't using its back, really. They were kind of more of a nuisance than anything. So it actually started to leave the whale, the back legs. They still have a pelvis bone to this day, and they still have a hind, very small limb, but it has no function at all. So this, the pelvis and the hind limb of the whale, this is a kind of structure that was once in a pre-whale organism, and it didn't use it anymore, so it lost it. Because if they were still there, those hind legs, it would still require a lot of energy for the whale to supply blood, oxygen, everything to these hind limbs. So if we're just not using them and we're still trying to keep them alive, why even have them? So the whale actually lost them over time since it was living in the water. And that's how we have kind of the modern whale today. So the modern whale is a mammal, but it still needs to breathe just like regular mammals do. So that's why it has to hoist the baby up to the surface so it can breathe. Okay, so next time, guys, we are going to go over biogeography and a few of the different structures that we see in our organisms. Have a good rest of your day, guys, and I will see you next time.